My name is Dr. Elena Marquez. I've been an emergency physician for over 12 years, but the case I'm about to tell you about still keeps me awake at night. I trained in Miami, where trauma comes fast and often, but I took a position at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Tucson, thinking the pace would be more manageable, maybe even kinder. I was wrong. Out here, the desert is deceptive, quiet on the surface, but underneath it hides some of the most brutal accidents and most tragic violence I've ever seen. That night began like so many others. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the antiseptic sting in the air, the monitors already alive with alarms before I even signed in. The trauma bay was waiting, stocked, and sterile, but nothing could have prepared me for what came through those sliding doors. I've worked countless codes. I've seen every form of injury a body can endure. But this case, it wasn't just medicine. It was something I still can't explain. Something that cut deeper than the physical wounds in front of me. And even though it's been years since that night, the memory of it clings to me like a second skin I can't peel away. I had been on shift since mid-afternoon, one of those days where time doesn't feel linear in the emergency department. It stretches and collapses, depending on how many ambulances roll in, how many lives you're trying to hold together. I remember walking into the trauma unit at St. Catherine's Medical Center, adjusting the stethoscope around my neck, as though the gesture could brace me against the weight of what was to come. The ER has a rhythm, a pulse, of its own. You hear it in the low hum of monitors, the steady beep of heart tones, the hiss of oxygen flow. You smell it too. The mix of antiseptic, sweat, blood, and that metallic tang of fear that families bring in with them. Nurses chart with tired eyes. Orderlies wheel stretchers past one another like a ballet of urgency, and you learn to move with it, to trust muscle memory when thought lags behind. On that night, I told myself it would be just another shift. We lie to ourselves like that sometimes. It was close to midnight when the trauma alert came over the radio. Male patient, mid-30s, multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen, en route via EMS. ETA, 5 minutes. The words penetrating trauma barely scratch the surface of the chaos that phrase unleashes. I tightened the lead on my ID badge and pulled on gloves, glancing at my team. Nurses Maria and Kevin, both seasoned, both already pulling open the trauma cart drawers, checking IV lines, readying blood tubing. The respiratory therapist, Erin, was setting up intubation gear. We were ready. At least, as ready as we thought. The paramedics burst through the double doors, gurney wheels rattling, their voices clipped and loud above the clamor. Male, 35, multiple stab wounds, hypotensive, tachy, GCS 8. We've got 2 large bore IVs. He's gotten a liter of fluid en route, pressure still dropping. I caught a glimpse of the patient then, shirt shredded, chest slick with blood, skin already paling, eyes half-lidded. His breaths were shallow, ragged, each one a battle his body was losing. On 3, 1, 2, 3. We lifted him onto our table, monitors clipped on, the trauma bay erupting into ordered chaos. His vitals blinked onto the screen. Heart rate 142, blood pressure 68/40, oxygen saturation plummeting. Too low, too fast. Airway first. Erin, get the tube. The room shrank to focus as we slid into our practice dance. Laryngoscope light glinting. Tube advanced past vocal cords. Confirmation of placement with the chest rise. End title, CO2 reading. The relief was fleeting. His blood pressure nosedived further. Monitors screaming as if in protest. Start blood. 2 units O negative now. Maria spiked the bag with practiced speed, the crimson fluid dripping into his veins. Kevin readied the next, pressing gauze against the gaping wounds to staunch what little could be held back. I leaned in close, my gloved hands probing for source of bleeding, mind already cataloging possibilities. Pericardial tamponade, liver laceration, lung injury. He needed an OR, not an ER, but first he needed to survive long enough to get upstairs. Pressure's not coming up, Kevin said, voice flat but urgent. Prepare for thoracotomy, I heard myself say, the words tasting bitter, even as I formed them. An emergency thoracotomy in the trauma bay is a last-ditch gamble, a move reserved for the brink between life and death. I knew we were already there. But before we made the first incision, something happened. His eyes fluttered open. Just barely, but enough. And he looked at me, not at the ceiling, not at the lights, but directly into me, as if he knew exactly where he was and who was holding his life in their hands. His lips parted, blood pooling at the corner of his mouth, and he whispered one word. Don't. It was soft, ragged, almost lost in the mechanical beeping and shouted commands. But I heard it. We all did. For a moment, the room froze. The monitors still blaring, the suction still humming, but the people in that room, myself included, caught in a stunned breath. Don't what? I asked, leaning closer, but his eyes had already clouded again, his body going slack against the table. He wasn't conscious anymore. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it. An involuntary murmur, the last flicker of oxygen in his brain firing meaningless syllables. But another part of me, the part that still wakes at 3 a.m. remembering that moment, swears he meant it, swears it was intentional. We cut. Rib spreader opened, chest cavity laid bare under the sterile drapes, my gloved hands inside the human cage of bone and tissue. We found what we feared. Lacerated heart, blood flooding where it shouldn't. We clamped, packed, compressed, fighting against the tide. At one point, his heart stopped completely, flatline stretching across the monitor in a mocking silence that seemed louder than any alarm. We massaged the heart directly, feeling the weight of it in our palms, coaxing, begging, commanding it to beat again. Against odds, against logic, it did. For a time, the room had grown hot under the fluorescent lights, sweat trickling down my neck beneath the surgical cap. My voice was steady, but inside I felt the cracks forming. I thought of his face, that whisper. Don't. Was it fear? Resignation? Knowledge? I shoved the thought away, focusing instead on suture, clamp, suction. Minutes blurred into hours, or so it felt, until finally we had enough control to transfer him to the operating room upstairs. But I knew, even as we wheeled him toward the elevator, that the odds were stacked like a wall we couldn't scale. I felt it deep in my bones, that this case was different, that this man's story wasn't done speaking. Not yet. I watched his blood trail stain the tile floor as the gurney disappeared down the hallway, and I remember feeling something I rarely allow myself in that room. Dread. Not just fear for the patient, but a sense that what had just unfolded was larger than any medical explanation could hold. And that was only the beginning. The operating room swallowed him whole, the sterile doors swinging shut with a hiss as though sealing away not just the patient, but the weight of what we had already endured. I stood in the hallway outside for a moment longer than I should have, watching the red streaks fade into the linoleum as housekeeping staff rushed in with mops. I told myself to let it go, that the strange whisper was nothing, just dying neurons firing random fragments of sound. But my chest was tight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been told something I wasn't meant to ignore. Back in the trauma bay, silence fell in the wake of his departure. My team busied themselves in that ritual of recovery, restocking carts, replacing blood units, disinfecting the counters. We have to do it that way. Reset the space, reset the mind, prepare for the next storm. But I caught Maria glancing at me as she wiped down the gurney rails. There was something in her eyes, something unspoken, that told me she had heard the whisper too. She wanted to ask what it meant. Instead, she just pressed her lips into a line and kept working. I stepped away, into the physician's lounge, a small haven that never feels far enough from the noise. The vending machine hummed in the corner, the smell of burnt coffee rising from a pot that had been left on too long. I poured myself a cup anyway, my hands shaking just enough to ripple the surface. I told myself to drink, to ground myself in something normal. But nothing about that moment was normal. I checked the OR board on the monitor, watching his case scroll across in red. Exploratory laparotomy, thoracotomy repair. Time started to blur. I checked charts, sutured a laceration in another bay, counseled a frightened mother about her son's asthma attack. But every time I looked at the board, my eyes fell back on his case. The clock ticked past 1 a.m., then 2, then 3. Still in surgery. That long in the OR can mean hope or futility. It's impossible to know until you get the call. Around 3:30, I was summoned upstairs. "We need you," the surgical resident's voice crackled over the line. "He's crashing." When I entered the OR, the heat hit me first. The surgical lights bore down, turning the scene into something otherworldly. The surgeons were elbow deep, suction screaming, clamps and retractors glinting with blood. His chest was still open, heart exposed, pulsing weakly under the pressure of direct massage. Bags of blood hung in rows, dripping into him as fast as we could replace what he lost. He coded again. The attending surgeon barked, not looking up. "Get ready for another round." We shocked him once, twice. The monitor fluttered, then held on a jagged rhythm, barely qualifying as a heartbeat. The room exhaled, but no one relaxed. I moved closer, leaning down to assess him, my hands pressing gently against his skin. And then, impossibly, his head turned. His eyes opened, not glassy, not reflexive, but with intention. He looked right at me again, and his lips moved. The mask muffled his words, but I swear to this day I heard him. "Stop." It was stronger this time, not a breathy plea, but a command. My pulse jumped, and for the briefest second, my hands froze where they rested. The resident across from me glanced up, as though he'd heard it too, but neither of us spoke. The monitor wailed again, as his pressure bottomed out. We worked frantically, cycling through compressions, epinephrine, more blood, more hope, poured into a body that seemed determined to resist every effort. The surgeons fought, but the heart they held refused to return to the rhythm we needed. Each time it paused, each time we pushed it back, I felt as though we were defying not just biology but something deeper, something that wanted to pull him away. After nearly 40 minutes, we reached the point where medicine itself falters, where skill and training give way to futility. The attending surgeon's voice cut through. "Time of death, 4:12. The words settled heavy in the room. We removed our gloves, one by one, the snap of latex echoing like a final punctuation mark. His chest was left open, draped with sterile sheets, the body cooling under the relentless lights. I pulled my mask down, breathing stale air, and stared at the face of a man who should have been silent. And yet, his voice still rang in my ears. "Don't. Stop." I wanted to believe it was just me. Fatigue, adrenaline, the mind playing tricks after hours of heightened focus. But as we covered him, I saw the scrub nurse cross herself quietly. I saw the resident's hands trembling as he charted the details. We all felt it, even if no one dared put it into words. I walked out of the OR into the darkened hallway, my body moving on autopilot. Hospitals at that hour are paradoxical. Endless noise within the units, silence in the corridors. I could hear my own footsteps against the tile, echoing louder than they should have. I stopped at a window overlooking the desert, the sky still ink black, with only a hint of dawn threatening the horizon. My reflection stared back at me, pale, hollow-eyed, blood smudged across my cheek where a mask had slipped. I thought of his words, replaying them. "Don't. Stop." I tried to rationalize. Patients murmur, their vocal cords react, the brain spits out fragments in hypoxic states. It happens. But twice? With focus? With intent? That wasn't reflex. That was will. By the time I returned downstairs, word had already reached the trauma unit. Maria's face told me she knew. "He didn't make it," I said flatly, and she nodded, her eyes slipping past me as though she couldn't bear to meet them. But the night wasn't done with me. Because what came next? What I found when I returned to the Bay turned this case from tragedy into something I still can't explain. The trauma bay felt different when I walked back in, as though the air itself had thickened. The fluorescent lights hummed with their usual indifference. The same sterile smell clung to the corners, but there was something under it all, a weight, an invisible static that raised the hairs on my arms beneath the sleeves of my scrubs. Maria and Kevin were tidying, the gurneys stripped bare, fresh linens already spread for the next patient, yet they moved more slowly than usual. Their silence was not the ordinary postcode exhaustion. It was heavier, deliberate. I paused near the nurse's station, shuffling through charts, pretending for their sake that everything was routine, but my eyes kept flicking to the empty bed, as though expecting it to be occupied again. Maybe that's why I noticed it first. The monitor. Still on, still glowing faintly, though no patient lay beneath its sensors. The pulse oximeter, unhooked, rested on the rail, yet the screen showed a reading. Not zeros, not flatline. Numbers. A heart rate, 78. Oxygen saturation, 96%. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I walked closer, leaning in, my breath fogging the plastic casing. The leads weren't even connected. The blood pressure cuff lay coiled on the counter, but the monitor was alive, as if it refused to accept the truth we had pronounced upstairs. "Kevin," I said, my voice catching, "come here." He stepped over, eyebrows drawn, and when he saw the screen, his mouth fell open just slightly. "It's still reading." Maria joined us, wiping her hands on a towel. She stared, then shook her head sharply, as though forcing herself back to logic. "It's a glitch. These monitors do it sometimes. Ghost readings, residual signals." She said it with authority, but her voice carried the tremor of disbelief. I wanted to believe her. I wanted it to be nothing but faulty machinery. Yet I knew these monitors too well, their quirks, their failures. This wasn't that. The numbers held steady, rhythmical, purposeful. And then the beeping started, that steady, insistent tone we associate with life, with presence. Beep, beep, beep. A phantom heartbeat echoing through the bay. Maria slapped the power button. The screen went black. The sound died. Silence reclaimed the room. She exhaled shakily. "See? Just a glitch." But even in the silence, I swear I still heard it. Not through the speakers, but somewhere deeper, behind my ears, in the cavity of my chest, a rhythm not my own. Before I could speak, the overhead pager cracked through. "Dr. Marquez to Trauma 2. Dr. Marquez, Trauma 2. I turned, grateful for the interruption, though my pulse hammered with unease. Trauma 2 was just across the hall. I stepped inside, forcing myself back into the rhythm of medicine. A young man, maybe 21, had collapsed at a nightclub. Possible overdose. Unresponsive. His friends huddled at the door, eyes wide, voices stumbling over explanations. We worked quickly. IV access, airway assessment, labs drawn. His heart rhythm was erratic, a storm of ventricular tachycardia threatening collapse. As I prepared the defibrillator, I heard it again, that voice, low, rasping, threaded with command. "Stop." I froze, hand hovering over the paddles. It was his voice, the man from earlier, the one we'd lost upstairs. I whipped my head around, but the room was filled only with my team, faces drawn in focus, none of them speaking. The patient's heart flatlined then, the monitor screaming its shrill alarm. Kevin thrust the paddles toward me. "Now, doctor." I shocked him, the jolt rippling through his chest. The body arched, slammed back onto the gurney. The monitor flickered, then steadied into a weak but present rhythm. He lived, at least for now. I stepped back, sweat cold against my skin, my own breath uneven. No one else reacted to the voice. No one else seemed to hear it. But I knew. I knew. When we stabilized the young man and transferred him to ICU, I lingered by the nurse's station, staring down at my hands as though they belonged to someone else. Maria touched my arm gently. "You okay?" I opened my mouth to lie, to tell her yes, but the words caught. Instead, I whispered, "Did you hear him?" Her expression faltered. For a second, just a second, I saw recognition flicker in her eyes, but she shook her head. "No, Elena, no one said anything." I wanted to press, to demand, but exhaustion pinned me down. I leaned back in the chair, letting the hum of the unit swallow me whole. Around us, the ER carried on as it always does. Stretchers rolling in, alarms sounding, families weeping. But under it all, I felt the presence of something I couldn't name. Something watching, lingering, refusing to release me from its grip. And then came the ripple effect. Because it wasn't just me. Over the next hours, small things began to happen. An orderly swore he saw a man's silhouette pass through the trauma bay, even though it was empty. A security guard reported hearing someone call for help in the stairwell. But when he opened the door, the corridor was bare. Maria dropped a tray of instruments when the monitor in Trauma 1 lit up by itself, displaying a perfect sinus rhythm with no patient attached. I tried to dismiss each as fatigue, coincidence, imagination stretched thin by too many hours and too much loss. But together they wove a pattern I couldn't ignore. A presence that hadn't left with the body. A voice that hadn't gone silent. By the time the sun began to creep across the horizon, painting the desert in pale orange, I felt drained in a way I'd never known. Not just physically, but spiritually, as though something had drawn from me more than I had to give. I went home at shift's end, collapsing into bed, but sleep offered no escape. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Pale, blood-slick, whispering words that rang louder in the silence of my mind than they ever had in the trauma bay. Don't. Stop. Even in the safety of daylight, I began to question myself. Had I misheard? Had I lost my grip on reason? The mind is capable of conjuring anything under strain. But the evidence lingered. Machines that read life where there was none. Whispers that paralleled his voice. Shadows no one could explain. And worst of all was the sense, growing stronger with each passing day, that the message wasn't finished. That what I heard was only the beginning. Morning bled into the next night as if the desert had forgotten how to draw a clean line between days, and I found myself back under the same humming lights, the same antiseptic sting in the air that never quite fades even after you shower and stand in your kitchen trying to remember how to taste food. I told myself I was rested enough, that what I'd heard and felt was simply the fatigue of a bad call, stitched to a worse outcome, but the moment my badge unlocked the ER doors, the memory returned intact, like a hand on the back of my neck guiding me toward the trauma bays. I started with the ritual I always fall back on when my mind's not trustworthy. I checked the machines. Biomedical had already tagged the monitor from the empty reading. A yellow sticker with tidy block letters said inspected, no fault found. I pulled the service log from the rack. Past electrical safety, noise floor nominal, self-test clean. I traced the leads with my fingers, pressed the power, watched the boot sequence spill across the glass. Baseline zeros. I clipped a lead to my own finger. Saw my pulse, not his. Rationality felt good in that small square moment. It didn't last. A family was waiting in the quiet room for me, and the charge nurse said they'd been there since first light. A woman in her 50s with wind-chapped cheeks and eyes that had decided not to blink until she had answers. A younger man with the coiled restlessness of someone who needs a wall to hit but knows the wall will win. A girl maybe 9 or 10, too still, hands folded around a stuffed javelina, the kind they sell in the gift shop, as if desert animals can be cute if you sew a smile onto them. I introduced myself and sat, because standing makes bad news feel like a passing hurricane when it's actually a crater. I told them we'd done everything. I told them he had died in the operating room at 4:12 a.m., I did not tell them that before he died, he had looked at me with eyes that knew how the story ended. The woman, his mother, her name was Alicia, asked the question all mothers ask, the one that has 1,000 medical answers and none that satisfy. Did he suffer? I explained shock, the mercies and curses of anesthetic, the way consciousness thins in hypoxia, how the nervous system, in its last defense, sometimes quiets pain. The young man, his brother, Mateo, asked who had done this, and I could only tell him that police were involved, and we could not share details yet. The girl said nothing, but at one point she lifted the javelina toward me, as if offering collateral in a deal I couldn't keep, and I felt something crack beneath my ribs. His name was Luis, 35. Worked the night shift at a distribution center off the interstate. He had a scar above his left eyebrow from falling off a bike at 11. He loved green chile stew, hated needles, carried his daughter on his shoulders until his knees hurt. The facts were ordinary in the way that makes grief harder. because ordinary lives are heavy with the daily meaning you only see when it's taken. When I left the room, I filed the death packet like muscle memory. Pronouncement note, time of death verification, the cascade of calls that follows a life's last minute. Organ procurement services had already screened him out in the OR because his injuries were too extensive. There are days when even generosity can't find purchase. The medical examiner accepted jurisdiction given the manner of death. There is so much paperwork around the end of a person that you could convince yourself the bureaucracy is care. Later, on a break that didn't feel like one, I pulled the chart to read what the surgeon had written. Objective language is our church in those moments. Estimated blood loss, interventions attempted, rhythms observed, medications administered. The attending had charted the second code time precisely. What he didn't chart, what I didn't either, were the words Luis had formed. Even if I believed we should, there is no field for that, no box for a warning we didn't understand. When the shift slowed in the thin hours before dawn, I went to radiology. Not because I expected the films to explain a voice, but because I wanted the tangible map of his injuries in front of me, something to hold my mind to bone and parenchyma. The CT that had been cut short by his instability was a smear of motion artifact, but the portable chest x-rays told a clean, brutal story. Widened mediastinum from blood, left-sided hemothorax, subcutaneous emphysema tracking along lines that don't respect borders. The lines were honest. They did not mention a second heartbeat echoing where no body lay. On the way back, I detoured through the stairwell the security guard had said was calling. It smelled like mop water and cold concrete. I waited, feeling foolish, listening to the layered silences hospitals make. Elevator cables whispering, a door 3 floors down thudding, the intermittent sigh of air through vents. No voice. But on the landing between 3 and 4, a faint coppery scent threaded through the air, and even though there were no visible stains, I knew in my body that blood had passed here, and recently. We tell ourselves scent is unreliable, contaminated by expectation. Maybe it is. Maybe I was coaxing ghosts from molecules that didn't care what I needed them to say. By the third night after Luis's death, the stories began to accumulate in ways that made dismissal feel like an act of willful blindness. An experienced ICU nurse told me her dopamine infusion pumps double-silenced at exactly 4:12, their alarms showing no fault like a mirror of biomedical sticker. A respiratory therapist reported that a ventilator in an empty room cycled a single breath, one it should not have taken. The orderly who swore about the silhouette now added that when he turned, the figure had not vanished in the theatrical way shadows do, but simply wasn't there, and the absence felt like a presence that had changed its mind. I kept a quiet list in my pocket notebook, the same cheap spiral bound I use for to-dos and grocery items when my life is behaving. I noted times, locations, people's names. I drew lines where lines shouldn't go. I tried to make a pattern that would prove there wasn't one. I also did the other thing doctors do when the outside world feels like it's tilting. I read papers on monitor artifact, capacitive coupling, electromagnetic interference from elevators, from cell phones in maintenance mode, from defibrillator discharge memory bleed. I read about phantom alarms and cognitive priming and the probability of false correlation during periods of elevated arousal. I texted a friend in biomedical engineering who sent me screenshots of an article about motion ghosting and pulse oximetry displays after abrupt disconnect. None of it mapped cleanly onto what we'd seen. None of it explained a stable sinus rhythm on a powered monitor with no leads attached, or a voice that spoke in the shape of a decision. I considered the damage massive blood loss and hypoxia can do to a physician who won't admit she's human. I thought of sleep debt as a toxin, of cortisol as a solvent that dissolves the eyebrow-raising part of the brain that says no. I left my house one afternoon and couldn't remember whether I had turned off the stovetop burner under a kettle I hadn't boiled. I turned the car around. The burner was cold. The kettle was in the sink. I had put it there and had no memory of how. The guilt came at odd angles. I began to wonder whether I had ignored a pre-hospital detail because I was focused on the injuries that shouted louder. I called the paramedic who had brought Luis in, her name was Dana, and asked if he'd said anything en route. She paused long enough for me to hear the diesel of the garage in the background, and then she said he had tried to talk, yes, but they were bagging him and all she'd heard was a wet consonant and a swallow of air that sounded like desire and failure. She hadn't been able to make out a word. She asked if there was a reason. I said I was just filling in documentation gaps, which was true and not. That night, the detective assigned to the case came by with a copy of a personal effect, something innocuous at first glance. A folded slip of paper that had been in Luis's back pocket with a grocery list on one side and a set of numbers on the other, a string that looked like a date and time, and then a crude instruction. Don't open. The detective asked whether it meant anything to me medically, some reference to wound care or ports. I said no, because it didn't. After he left, I sat in the staff bathroom with the paper balanced on my knee, like contraband. And you can tell yourself, caution is superstition. But I didn't turn it over again for a long minute, afraid of a thing I had already seen. When I did, the numbers were just numbers, banal in their insistence. The instruction felt like a dare sent back through ordinary time. On call again, I passed the ICU glass and saw Alicia, his mother, standing at the end of a corridor that looked toward the mountains, her reflection and the purple bruise of dawn layered like double exposure. She had come to sign forms. We spoke about autopsy, about release, about the church she attended, and the food people bring when words can't do a job. Then, unexpectedly, she asked me if her son had said anything. Not whether he suffered, not whether he felt alone, whether he had spoken. I should have said no. The way I had rehearsed. I should have sheltered her from a mystery that did not hold her. I told the softer version, that sometimes, in those last minutes, people will move their lips or shape a sound as if to say a word not meant for us to hear. And that if he did, I believed it was toward peace. She nodded, but her eyes narrowed, as if testing the fit of the lie against something older in her. She told me that when he was little, he would tell her not to open the door during summer storms because the desert swaps its breath with the house, and the house sometimes breathes something in. I did not know what to do with that, so I folded it into the other unclassifiable findings of the week. The staff began to avoid trauma too, if they could help it. Nurses traded assignments quietly. The bay had become a knot in the gut of the unit's floor plan. A place we could rationalize around, but not through. I started taking the long way to radiology, because the short way brushed too close to a memory that felt like it had intentions of its own. I had developed a habit of touching the doorframe every time I entered the trauma unit, a private superstition I couldn't justify to a medical student if asked. I told myself it was grounding. I told myself it was nothing. The night before the autopsy, a thunderhead built over the Catalinas and pushed heat into the lobby like a second air conditioning system set to desert. We were quiet. Statistically, the hour between 1 and 2 is a lull. And I sat at the desk writing notes that should have been easy. Sentences that in any other week would have pulled themselves into lines. The overhead pager coughed, stuttered, and then spoke in a voice that was not the operator's. Too low, too close, as if the speaker was at the base of my skull. Stop! I stood so fast, the chair struck the counter behind me. Maria asked if I was okay. Kevin glanced over, and then back to his charting like he'd trained himself this week not to stare at surprises. Before I could answer, the monitor in Trauma 2 clicked on by itself, a gesture that is physically possible and yet never happens without a hand. And the waveform drew itself from left to right, single lead, perfect P waves, QRS, narrow, a heart comporting itself. 78 beats per minute. No patient, no leads, no wires. Every explanation I had assembled in the past 3 days burned away like paper touched by a quiet flame. I walked into the bay because the only thing that seemed worse than being in it was leaving it to someone else. The air felt colder by a single degree, the kind of difference you notice in a church when a door has been opened behind you, and light you don't see changes, temperature you don't feel. I stood at the foot of the bed and said a thing I had not heard myself say since I was a resident who still believed in bargaining with the immutable. If you need something, tell me plain. The monitor did not answer with language. It answered with rhythm, the rate lifting to 82, then settling, like agreement phrased as physiology. I turned it off. I unplugged it. I rolled it to the wall. Then I sat in the chair beside the empty bed and waited, because waiting felt like the only honest procedure left. Outside, lightning stitched itself from cloud to ridge, and somewhere in the building a baby cried, and another human was born, and an old man coughed and kept doing it because habits are what hold us when reason runs out. I waited until the storm moved east, and the hour rolled itself into the day the medical examiner would cut answers from the quiet Luis had left us. I told myself that whatever they found would anchor this story to matter. I told myself I needed the weight of a definitive. I told myself a lot of things as I watched the door to the trauma bay like a horizon that owed me a sunrise. The autopsy report arrived in my inbox 2 days later, stamped with the precision of a process designed to hold chaos still. The cause of death was unsurprising. Multiple penetrating injuries to the thorax and abdomen, exsanguination, cardiac laceration. Manner, homicide. The language was clinical, neat. There were no anomalies, no unexplained pathologies. Nothing that could account for a voice after death, or a monitor that beat in rhythm without a body to drive it. Just tissue described, weighed, photographed, dissected, cataloged into a silence that spoke of nothing but the physical. I read it 3 times, searching for some overlooked phrase, some footnote that would explain the strangeness that clung to all of us. There was none. I closed the file and sat at my desk, the hum of the hospital muffled by the walls, and I realized then that medicine had reached its border, the edge of the map we write with scalpels and textbooks. Beyond that line was something else, something unnamed. But the story didn't end with the report. Hospitals are places where memory sticks, not just to people, but to rooms, to objects, to air itself. Trauma 2 remained different. Staff whispered about it now, avoiding it when they could, trading assignments with excuses about preference or fatigue. The housekeeping staff complained of cold spots, of shadows that moved against the fluorescent lights. One orderly swore she heard a man's voice whispering in Spanish, though she couldn't make out the words. She never set foot in that bay again. And me? I carried it differently. I carried it into every patient I touched, every family I faced. I became slower to pronounce, lingering over monitors longer, watching pupils with a desperation I hadn't admitted before. The finality of death had been a hard line in my training. This case blurred it, smudged it until my certainty thinned into questions I could not ask out loud. In the weeks after, I tried to ground myself in routine. I ran through old case files late at night, reviewing codes and resuscitations as if repetition could steady me. I combed through literature, not just the journals of medicine, but obscure texts on near-death experiences, on auditory hallucinations, on the psychology of overworked clinicians. The more I read, the less I understood. Accounts from colleagues around the world, doctors, nurses, paramedics, all described moments that defied what we call real. Patients speaking after asystole, families reporting words whispered in empty rooms, machines activating without cause. And though I had always filed those stories under stress, under myth, now they resonated with a sharpness I could no longer ignore. It crept into my personal life, too. I stopped sleeping well. When I did, I dreamed of trauma, too. Not of Luis directly, but of the monitor. Always the monitor, glowing in the dark, pulsing a rhythm that wasn't mine. Sometimes in the dream, I would approach it and see numbers climbing. 78, 82, 90. Each beat louder, a sound more than a sight, filling the room until I woke, gasping, heart pounding out of sync with the silence around me. I never told anyone the full truth. To my colleagues, I was still the attending who had fought hard, who had done everything, who had lost a patient in a brutal case no one could have saved. To my family, I was the daughter, the sister, who seemed quieter on the phone, who deflected questions about how work was going. To my patients, I was still the doctor in the white coat, steady hands and clipped words of reassurance. But inside, something had shifted. A fracture invisible on imaging, yet widening with time. Sometimes, when I sit alone in the lounge, I hear the words again, as if they are stitched into the walls of my memory. Don't. Stop. What was he asking? Was it fear? Pleading for the fight to end? Or was it a warning? Don't open something we weren't meant to. The words cling to me because they are incomplete, a sentence half written across the border between life and death. And what unsettles me most is that part of me obeyed. I keep going back to that bay. I sit in the chair beside the empty bed. I listen. Not because I want to, but because I can't not. I tell myself it's survivor's guilt, transference, the brain trying to knit narrative from trauma. I tell myself I'm still rational, still anchored. But when the clock strikes 4:12, whether I'm in the ER or at home staring at the ceiling, I feel the shift. A current in the air, a prickle in my skin, a memory refusing to fade. We save who we can, we lose who we can't, and we live with the in-between. That's the creed of emergency medicine. But Luis's case taught me that the in-between is larger than I ever wanted to admit. It stretches beyond monitors and charts, beyond the tidy boxes of our reports, into a silence that isn't empty, but full of things we can't name. People ask sometimes, usually medical students shadowing me, what the hardest part of the job is. They expect me to say the blood, the chaos, the hours. I never tell them the truth. I never tell them it's this. The moments that defy explanation, that haunt you not because they were violent, but because they were impossible. I see his mother sometimes, in the grocery store or at church, her eyes tired but steady. She doesn't ask about that night anymore, but sometimes, when our eyes meet, I think she knows. Not the details, not the monitor, not the voice, but that something happened beyond what the paperwork says. And in those moments, I wonder if Luis was right to warn me. If I should have listened differently. If I should have stopped. I'll never know, and that unknowing is the hardest medicine to practice. The case will always haunt me, not for what we failed to repair, but for what refused to stay broken.